Have you guys ever noticed that the trucking industry loves talking about a driver shortage right up until it's time to, actually pay drivers better, treat them better, stop running them out of the business? It's kind of funny, isn't it? We're constantly told that there aren't enough drivers. You hear it from companies, from industry groups, from all the articles that treat it like some settled fact. But in this same industry, there are still drivers struggling to make decent money. There's still drivers sitting unpaid at docks, a lot of experienced drivers walking away, and also still plenty of companies that act like seasoned drivers are easy to replace. That doesn't sound like a labor shortage. That sounds like an industry that got comfortable burning through people and decided to call it a workforce problem. All right, drivers, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. This is Behind the Wheel. My name is Jen, and I appreciate all of you coming to join me today in this episode. And today we're getting into one of the most repeated phrases in the entire trucking industry, and also one of the most misleading phrases I've ever heard, which is the so-called driver shortage. If you've spent any real time in trucking, you've heard that phrase more times than you can count. It comes back around constantly. Somebody writes about it, somebody warns about it, somebody frames the entire future of freight around it. And we're all supposed to accept it as the complete explanation. But the longer you stay in this business, the more that phrase starts to feel incomplete at best, and at worst, like a convenient story told by people who'd rather talk about the symptom than deal with the cause. Because what are we talking about? Are we talking about a shortage of people physically capable of driving a truck? Or are we talking about an industry that struggles to hold on to drivers because too many of its jobs are built on low pay, wasted time, unrealistic expectations, and business models that chew through people faster than they can build careers? These two things are very, very different conversations. And too often, the industry hides behind the first one so it doesn't have to deal with the second one. So today, that's where we're going. We're going to dig into the driver shortage narrative, talk about why so many drivers don't buy it, and make the case that the real problem in trucking has a lot less to do with supply and a whole lot more to do with what happens to people once they get into it. All right, so let's start with road headlines. And today's real headline isn't just that the trucking industry keeps repeating the driver shortage story. We already know that. The real headline is that there is still a significant split between how industry groups describe this problem and what the broader labor data actually suggests is going on. On one side, organizations have continued to argue that the shortage is real, particularly in OTR trucking. Their position is that the industry will need to bring in 1.2 million new drivers over the next decade, mostly to replace retirees and keep pace with freight demand. Now, on paper, that sounds pretty dramatic. Like the country is simply running out of people willing to drive a truck. But if you look a lot deeper, the picture gets considerably more complicated. Federal labor research has pointed out for years that what people call a driver shortage is concentrated far more heavily in long-distance truckload than in trucking as a whole. This isn't a blanket nationwide shortage of human beings. It's a problem in a specific segment with a specific working conditions. And that distinction matters enormously because it points toward conditions rather than capacity as the real driver of the issues. The Bureau of Labor Statistics puts the number of heavy and tractor-trailer truck driver jobs, I'll say that 5 times fast, at around 2.24 million as of 2024, with projected growth of about 4% through 2034 and roughly 237,000 openings per year. Now get this, the median annual pay came in around $57,440. None of that says trucking is easy. and none of it means companies aren't struggling to fill certain seats. But it does make the problem look a lot more like churn than simple nationwide shortage of available workers. And that's where turnover becomes the central issue. Because if you look at the numbers in truckload specifically, it's been pretty ugly for a long time. One analyst flagged annual turnover rate about 90% or higher at the mega carriers in trucking. They also pointed out that states continued issuing more than 400,000 new CDLs every single year. I mean, think about that combination for a second. Hundreds of thousands of people are entering the pipeline annually, and the industry is still acting like the main problem is a lack of people. If the front door is wide open, but people keep walking out the back, that is not a recruitment problem. That is a retention problem. That's a revolving door, not a shortage. Drivers themselves have been pretty clear about what the real pain is. ATRI's top industry issues surveys have consistently shown that compensation ranks near the top of driver concerns. And that makes sense because drivers don't experience this in an abstract labor market theory. They feel it in their paychecks. They feel it in the waiting time, in their home time, and dispatch quality, and whether the effort they're putting into the job is actually producing a life worth staying in. The financial pressure on carriers is real as well. ATRI reported in 2025 that the average cost of operating a truck ran roughly $2.26 per mile, with profitability getting squeezed from multiple directions. That context matters, but tight margins don't automatically prove a labor shortage. They can just as easily describe an industry where the conditions are rough, the margins are thin, and the least protected person in the chain is still the driver absorbing the pressure. So when you put all of this together, the turnover data, the CDL numbers, the compensation concerns, the segment-specific nature of the problem, the picture looks a lot messier than the phrase driver shortage makes it sound. Yes, there are companies that genuinely need drivers, especially in OTR truckload. But the evidence strongly suggests that the industry doesn't just struggle to recruit people, it struggles to keep them. And those are two very different problems that require two different solutions. Now, let's move into Doc Talk, because this is where the driver shortage story runs straight into real life. And it's going to start falling apart pretty quickly. Most drivers don't need an industry report to tell them whether trucking feels healthy. They can feel it in the daily rhythm of the job. They feel it in whether the paycheck makes sense for the sacrifice, whether the home time is real, whether dispatch actually knows what it's doing, and whether the job feels like something a person can sustain. That's where the truth lives. It's not in press releases or conference panels, but it's in whether the work is worth staying in. And for a lot of drivers, the honest answer is too many trucking jobs wear down people faster than they can build them up. A driver gets into the business looking for income, independence, and maybe a long-time career. Sometimes that happens, but a lot of times what they actually find is a crash course in unpaid waiting, unrealistic expectations, and the kind of daily friction that makes a person start quietly doing the math on whether the trade-off still makes sense. Drivers know the work is hard. Most of them choose it, knowing it was hard. What burns people isn't difficulty. It's the unnecessary difficulty. It's when the stress feels avoidable, and when the chaos feels manufactured, and when the money doesn't even come close to reflecting what the job is actually asking for them. That's when people leave. And that's why so many drivers hear driver shortage and quietly roll their eyes. Because to them it sounds like the industry is just describing the smoke while pretending there is no fire. So let's talk about what would actually make this better. Because that's the more useful conversation here. And it's one that the industry seems to always avoid. The most obvious starting point is driver time. If a driver is regularly losing hours sitting unpaid at docks, waiting on bad schedules, or whatever the case may be, that is one of the fastest ways to make this job feel unsustainable. It tends to send a very clear signal about how much the operation values the person running it. Respecting driver time, genuinely, operationally, not just an mission statement, would do more for retention than most any recruitment campaign. Right along that is the pay structure. The money has to make sense relative to the full reality of the work. Not just the rolling miles, but the waiting, all the delays, the disruptions, and the parts of the job that cost a driver something without showing up on a mileage report. Drivers don't live in neat paid mile boxes. They live in the real world, where the gaps between those miles still have a price. I think training is the one piece that gets underestimated the most. Too many new drivers get handed a sales pitch, a set of keys, and just enough orientation to be incredibly dangerous. And then the industry acts puzzled when they struggle or they quit. Better training builds safety. It builds confidence, it builds the professionalism, all at the same time. More importantly, it builds people who feel like they're actually prepared for what trucking is, rather than just people who feel like they got thrown into a system and got told to swim. Those two groups have very different retention rates. Then there's honesty. And I know that this probably sounds really simple, but it matters more than most companies seem willing to admit. A lot of drivers can handle the hard truths. What we don't really handle well and what we will not tolerate indefinitely is being sold one version of a job and then experiencing something completely different. If home time is going to be inconsistent, you need to tell that driver up front. If the miles swing with the market, you need to own that. People can adapt to real conditions a lot better than they can adapt to discovering they were misled. When trust is broken in the driver, it's insanely expensive to rebuild. And oftentimes it doesn't even get the chance to be rebuilt. And running through all of it is the question of basic day-to-day respect. Better planning, more realistic schedules, dispatch that actually communicates instead of just reacting. Fewer situations where the driver ends up absorbing every broken piece of the operation because nobody upstream wanted to own the problem. That's not asking for luxury. That's asking for a simple, functional workplace. And the gap between what drivers are asked to tolerate and what most other industries consider acceptable working conditions is wider than trucking likes to acknowledge. Because that's what so much of this really comes back to. Drivers aren't leaving because trucking is hard. They're leaving because too much of the hardship feels unnecessary, and too much of this cost keeps landing on the same person every single time. That is fixable. Not overnight and not everywhere, but it is fixable. And the industry has to be willing to call it what it is before it can start treating it like the priority it deserves to be. Until more of trucking gets serious about building jobs that feel stable, honest, and worth staying in, this cycle is going to keep running. Recruit, burn people out, replace them, repeat. That is not a labor strategy. That is an assembly line for turnover. And no amount of the shortage is coming headlines can change the fact that industry built the door drivers keep walking through on the way out. All right, so let's bring it all together, guys. What the driver shortage narrative really exposes is how often this industry reaches for a convenient explanation instead of an honest one. Driver shortage is a convenient frame because it sounds external. It sounds like a weather event, something that happened out there in the labor market beyond anyone's direct control. It makes the problem feel structural in a way that doesn't require anyone inside the industry to change much of anything. You don't fix a shortage by restructuring your operation. You just keep recruiting harder and hope the math improves. But the honest framework looks different. It asks people why they leave. It asks why experienced drivers are skeptical. It asks why newer drivers wash out at such a high rate and why the industry is often more willing to spend money on recruitment than on improving the conditions that make people leave in the first place. That framing is harder. It puts the responsibility closer to home. And that's probably why the industry doesn't reach for it as often as it should. Because drivers are not numbers on a hiring board. They are people making real trade-offs with their time, their health, and their home life. They're betting that the work is worth what it asks. And when the reward side of that equation stops making sense, people will leave. That is not mysterious. That is human nature. And no amount of recruitment spending is going to change that. So when I hear driver shortage, the question I want to ask back is shortage of what exactly? A shortage of people with a CDL? There are hundreds of thousands of new ones issued every year. Is it a shortage of experienced drivers willing to stay in conditions that ask for too much and give back too little? That's a different story entirely, because those are not the same problem. And treating them as if they are is how this industry keeps misdiagnosing itself and changing the wrong solution. The words we use shape the solutions we chase. If we keep calling it a shortage, the focus stays on replacing people. If we call it what it more often looks like, a retention problem, a conditions problem, or a respect problem, then the conversation has to be more honest and the responsibility gets harder to deflect. That's the shift that matters. And until it's willing to say that out loud, drivers are going to keep walking. The phrase driver shortage is going to keep coming back around, and nothing fundamental is going to change. That's the real conversation. So that's going to do it for today's episode of Behind the Wheel. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me today and listening to this episode. If this one hit home for you, make sure to share it with another driver. And also subscribe to the channel and leave a comment down below. And with all that being said, guys, stay safe out there. Keep your head on a swivel. And watch out for the folks in four-wheelers. And I will see you guys next week.